Thank you all for joining us for this live conversation with Professor Nicholas Rowe and Professor Annie Chandy Mathew. You can type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll begin with some questions from the YouTube channel where the talk was premiered. I'll start with you, Nick.
Okay.
You brought up the question of nationalism and nationhood in the film. Could I ask you to address it a bit further? As you know, Indians studying in English knew Shakespeare and the Romantics well, at least in generations past until recently. We learned to recite or sing Wordsworth's Daffodils and so on. And yes. I guess because we are all, in a sense, Macaulay's Minutemen, as they say, shaped in our educations by his 1835 Minute on Education, when a canon of English literature was created and exported to be taught in the colonies. Wordsworth and Keats would have studied the Greek and Latin classics. They did not study English literature at school. The English literature canon was being shaped in the colonies. What would Englishness have meant to them? Landscape, or as you say, language?
With reference to Keats, I think there are several ways of getting at this. The big picture first. While Keats was growing up as a child, and while he was growing up and during his school days, the backdrop was the Napoleonic Wars, which of course produced divisions of various kinds in British, or more particularly English culture. There's the more jingoistic supporters of the anti-French war, and then there's the more problematic attitude of liberals, dissenters, and people of more independent views. For example, John Clarke, Keats's schoolmaster at Enfield School, for whom the war with France was a more difficult proposition for various reasons, among them ideals of liberty continued from the early years of the French Revolution. So there is a question of patriotism that is tied up with the great national effort against France right the way through Keats's formative years. But then if we jump inside Enfield School, we can find a very interesting literary culture that embraced not only the classics, and Keats translated Virgil's Aeneid, don't forget, we're told, by Charles Cowden Clarke, one of his mentors at the school. He translated the whole of Virgil's poem. He also seems to have been far more accomplished in Latin than we might have supposed. It was his classical accomplishment that got him through his examinations at Guy's Hospital. And then more particularly in terms of English literature, it's likely that, we know, it's not just a matter of likelihood. It's certain that at the school Keats was reading poets such as Shakespeare and Spenser and Milton, who become, as it were, presiders, all three of them, in his subsequent poetic career. So that's an important starting point for Keats, I think. And staying with Keats's school at Enfield for just a moment longer, I started off by talking about the politics and the patriotism associated with the French war. For the community at Enfield, and particularly at Enfield School, the ideals of a much earlier formation of England, pre-Norman conquest, associated with King Alfred and with Winchester, and what was thought to be, and no doubt was, the first English constitution, dating from the reign of King Alfred, based in Winchester. And don't forget as well that this kind of foundational political moment during King Alfred's reign was also the time when ideas of the English language were forming, and ideas of a certain kind of English nationhood were taking hold, obviously to be overset by the Norman conquest of 1066 and the French imports, linguistic imports, associated with poets such as Chaucer. Now we know that there was a great deal of interest in King Alfred and the early English constitution at Enfield School. We know it was discussed. We know that there were various members of the Constitutional Association who were connected with Enfield School. So this is giving us a background to English politics, English culture, the English legal system, if you like, and also the English language, rooted before the French Revolution in Winchester, where, of course, Keats would eventually write To Autumn, a poem that I was arguing in that talk or lecture that you may have heard. To Autumn is a kind of archaeology or history of the English language, even as it is a wonderful lyrical celebration of autumn. So there are various layers here, I think, that we can work with from the contemporary moment during Keats's lifetime, but also the deeper past and its political and literary and linguistic associations associated with Enfield School and reaching as far back as, let's say, the 9th century in English history.
So that's interesting. You say that, in fact, he did study Shakespeare and Milton in school.
Yes.
Because Wordsworth, I think, it was just Greek and Latin. I don't think he read it. He read English authors outside, but not in school.
Yes, we know this because one of Keats's school friends, Edward Holmes, says that Keats had said to him that no one in their right mind would read Macbeth alone in a house at 2 o'clock in the morning. So schoolboy Keats said that. He'd obviously read Macbeth as a boy at the school. The difference with Wordsworth is that while Hawkshead School that was attended by Wordsworth was an exceptionally good grammar school, Enfield School, Clark's Academy, that Keats attended, was a rather more unusual establishment in that it had an unorthodox, independent, and what we might call progressive curriculum, in that it embraced not only the classics, but literature as well, as I've suggested, but also unusual subjects such as astronomy and simple engineering, gardening, even optics. It was a much broader, and as we might think now, more modern curriculum than you could find at the traditionally established schools, such as Hawkshead, or even places like Harrow and Eton. So Keats was indeed fortunate to attend this school. And for anyone who's interested in exploring it further, I've got a bit about it in John Keats, A New Life, the biography. And I did a book a long time ago, 20 years ago, I'm horrified to think, called John Keats and the Culture of Dissent, in which I described what went on at the school in some detail. It's a very exciting school, and it really was formative for Keats in giving him such a variety of exciting intellectual interests.
There's another question sort of come through. In the genre of literary biography that you specialize in, what are some of the challenges? Could you say a bit about your writing and research process? You know, you've spent a lot of time in archives, I'm sure. So tell us about some serendipitous discoveries, maybe, in the course of your research. Moment.
I think that with biography, you have to try and find, as it were, an angle or a way into the life that will open it out for you in a way that is imaginatively gratifying, as it were, for the biographer. There's no point in just going over a chronological routine, although some biographies do this. It seems to me you have to have some kind of individual imaginative engagement with your subject. My way into the life of Keats was the small gnats, do you remember, in the final stanza of To Autumn, that are rising and falling as the light wind lives or dies. And I started to wonder why this image was significant for Keats. And for those of us who've read all the way through his poems, you can find other instances of images that embrace this same kind of motion, a rising and falling motion. Even from his first poem, which is The Imitation of Spenser, the way that poem is, as it were, sculpted is looking down and then looking up and then looking down again at the water and then looking up again at the sun and the clouds in the sky. It's the same movement. He also has it in his poem, I Stood Tiptoe on a Little Hill, where one of the most striking images is of a schoolboy riding the branch of an elm, the springy branch of an elm tree, as schoolboys, I suppose, used to do before the age of the internet. In other words, going up and down on the branch and enjoying the rhythm, the rise and fall in so doing. And there are other instances throughout Keats, and this struck me as something that might be worth exploring. And so I followed from those traces in the poems themselves on, as it were, into the life insofar as I could discover it, as it were, emblems or tokens of what I came to believe was what we'd now call a bipolar personality. Keats's school friends say he was always in extremes, up or down, one way or another, but always in extremes. And it seems to me that the rising and falling pattern that we find so frequently in his poems was to do with his makeup as a young person. So it became possible to read the poems into the life and arguably vice versa. So that's one way of putting this. Finding an angle or a way into the life that will open out the life and the life narrative in a way that may be hopefully rewarding and new for readers. As for serendipitous discoveries, there was one that I made while I was researching the biography, but didn't follow up as I was doing so, and actually rediscovered later. And that's the mention of Mr. Keats, one of the surgeons at Guy's Hospital, in a newspaper article as attending a woman who'd been shot in the neck by her husband at a pub in South London. And she was brought into Guy's Hospital and tended to by Mr. Keats, one of the surgeons, who managed to get the pistol ball out of her neck and bandaged it up, and subsequently attended the inquiry into the incident and described what had happened and what the wound was. I'd spotted this some time ago and effectively lost it, and only rediscovered it 3 years after the biography was published. And I realized its significance then, and was able to do a bit more with the incident than I would have been able to do hitherto. But that kind of thing is serendipitous in the sense that it comes by chance, but also, as we all know, doing internet searches is a hit and miss business.
Right.
If you search for Keats to try and find this article, it won't turn it up. If you try and find it using Guy's Hospital, the search engines won't find it. The only combination that will find it, and I found this by chance, is pistol and Guy's Hospital. That will take you to it. So in a sense, it is all by chance. It's all good fortune or misfortune of one kind or another. But that's probably the best example that I could give you.
I'll have one last question for you, and then we'll go to some of the more general questions that have come up in the Q&A.
Okay.
You are chair of the Keats Foundation and a trustee of the Wordsworth Conference Foundation. And
Yes.
of course, sadly, this summer, they both got cancelled with the pandemic, including the Keats Bicentenary Conference.
Yes.
Could you tell us about some of the activities in the UK that keep the poetry and legacy of Keats and the other romantics alive? Something that we could possibly learn from for our own poetic traditions. And for our viewers, perhaps where they should go if they were to visit sites or archives of importance to Keats. Just a few key ones, because several people have written in saying that Keats is their favorite poet. So.
Right, okay. Well, it's a good question, particularly for our times. There are, of course, a number of websites. Do explore the Keats Foundation website. It's online. There are lots of links there, and it's kept updated. on a weekly basis. There's all sorts of things to explore there, so do have a look. You should also look at the Keats House Hampstead website. Keats House Hampstead is reopening, if not now, certainly in the next few days, so visitors will be welcome there very shortly. So that's been closed since March. It's reopening in July. Do look at the Keats Shelley Memorial website. That is the trust that looks after the Keats Shelley House in Rome. There are lots of good things to explore there, including recently posted digitized images of the manuscripts and other valuable sources that they have in their collection. It's well worth a good look. Then other sites you might want to explore, the Wordsworth Conference Foundation site. Just type in Wordsworth Conference Foundation. It'll give you all the information you need to know about the Wordsworth summer conferences and winter schools. Alas, as you said, Prateeti, all of them cancelled this year for all the reasons we all know too well. And then, of course, the Wordsworth Trust website. Do have a look at that for all the latest information about Dove Cottage and Townend and what's going on there during this summer, leading up to what I think will be the reopening of Dove Cottage in September. So those are some of the key ways into, I think, at least some of the romantic websites with which we're concerned in the UK. Was there another aspect to your question that you wanted me to address?
Yes, well, you've already mentioned some of the activities, the conferences that keep the legacy alive, and the sites. So that's good. We have another question from the Q&A box from someone who says, my question is, you mentioned that this Eve of St Mark and La Belle Dame were strong contenders to be included in the 1820 volume. So many of the posthumous poems are such gems and beloved poems. When I have fears, in a drear night of December, why did I laugh tonight, bright star? In your opinion, why did they not make it to the 1820 volume? Was it because of his own sense of uncertainty about his poetic work? The sense that his name was written on water. This is someone who goes by the initials MP.
Good, it's a very good question. And before I answer it, just let me point you to the videos of Keats's odes and the Eve of St Agnes being read on the Keats Foundation website. It's great fun. It's a wonderful reading by Matthew Coulton as Keats. And I'm sure everybody would enjoy that. All of those readings of the odes and of the Eve of St Agnes. Now, as for that very good question about the poems that were left out of the 1820 collection, as the questioner MT says, there's a host of poems that Keats could have put in. Certainly La Belle Dame sans Merci, a poem that is complete and that would have fitted with some of the themes that emerge in the course of the 1820 book, as might the Eve of St Mark as a complement to the Eve of St Agnes. And as the questioner says, there are various sonnets as well that could also have gone into the volume. As I think perhaps I suggested in the talk, it's quite a carefully designed volume insofar as it extends up to the Ode on Melancholy, with which Keats expected the volume to conclude. Now, it's arguable, as the excellent Keats scholar R.S. White at Australia Western University in Perth suggests, that there may be a coherent theme running throughout this volume associated with various aspects of melancholy. Bob White, who I've just mentioned, has a book coming out from Edinburgh University Press on exactly this subject. And the argument is that all of the poems in the collection, as selected by Keats, that is from Lamia to Ode on Melancholy, are connected by a preoccupation with different aspects of melancholy. Now, I would have said that La Belle Dame sans Merci might well have fitted with that agenda or programme, as we might call it. The Eve of St Mark might have done as well. Possibly Hyperion doesn't. That was Keats's publisher's choice. It was put there against his wishes, probably to fill out the volume, because if you take out Hyperion, what you're left with is a relatively thin book, like the 1817 volume. I was looking to see if I had a copy of it up there, but I don't. So the publishers, as it were, wanted to bulk out the book to make it bigger. But I think the question probably resolves upon the fact that Keats had a very clear conception of the kind of book that he wanted to publish, thematically coherent in many respects. And also don't forget that during these months he was increasingly ill and arguably unable to devote the time to the preparation of the volume that he otherwise might have done. So there could be an argument to be made for the fact that he literally didn't have more time to, as it were, go over other poems and prepare them for inclusion in the book. That's just a possible guess, but it's maybe a plausible one. Finally, just to show you how pressured this all was, the little advertisement that appears at the beginning of the book, you remember where the publishers apologise for the fact that Hyperion is incomplete and that it was put there against the author's wishes. That was put in while the proofs were being corrected. Keats never saw that advertisement, which explains why he was so irritated, if not angry, when he received his copy of the book, his early copies of the book, and found Hyperion at the end and that advertisement at the beginning, because it has overset the conception of the book as it was when he submitted it to the publishers. So that's just arguably one reason why the many other, let's say, works of genius that Keats literally had on hand at the time weren't included in the book.
There's one more question that has come in for you. And I know you have another commitment and will have to leave us shortly. So I'll address all the questions for you first. How would you teach Keats to, I guess, to students for whom English is not their primary language? Do you have, they have no historical background on English literature. How can we use Keats to teach the dynamics of the English language? This perhaps ties into what you said about, the Englishness.
It's a very good question. It's an excellent question. Many of the students that come into the classes that I've done over the years have a let's say a general but not very specific knowledge of British history during the 18th century, leading up into the period that we associate with the Romantics and on into the 19th century. So what I do with students of that kind is get them to read through a chronology and just to get a sense of the key events and a few key names, to give them a sense of, as it were, the hinterland of the topography, the historical topography of the period. That's one way of starting. Another way of doing this is to take a poem that is sufficiently compact and richly worked. I don't know, something like the Bright Star sonnet maybe, or Chapman's Homer, that other sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, something relatively compact, and ask them to read it through and start to think about aspects of the language. What words are working hard in various lines? I ask them to look at the right-hand margin and to check the rhyme scheme and to see what words are being used as rhyming words. And then I get them to look down the left-hand margin, let's say of a sonnet, and just see what words are being deployed at the start of each line, of each of the 14 down the left margin. And then I say, well, what is the effect of deploying the words in this particular way? What does it add to the energy and the buzz of the poem? And that usually gets a kind of helpful response from at least some of the students that can get a conversation going, and may lead us inside the lines to look at other words and to see what they're contributing. And then typically go on from that to look maybe at the effects of punctuation, that kind of thing, and to see how the rhythm of the line is being played off against the way the punctuation is set up at the end of the line and within each line. And that can pretty soon open up a helpful discussion that doesn't really depend upon historical knowledge or context at all, but which, through various associations that one could bring into play with particular words, can lead you into what I've called the hinterland of history surrounding the poem. History broadly considered, that is biographical and also more broadly considered. Does that help?
Yes, yes, that was a question from Nancy Vinolia, who must be a teacher.
Okay.
And then there are various general questions, I guess, that could be addressed by either of you. There was an early question that came in from Nikki about what are your favorite lines from the odes or poems of Keats? And there were also questions about what's your favorite poem of Keats? You know, so I know a favorite is a hard one to when you've read so much.
Is this addressed to me? Yes.
Yes, it could be. Yes, yes.
Or does Professor Mathew want to answer it?
Professor Mathew, I think you're on.
I would say I have several favorites, and one, of course, is Autumn, which is really the most satisfying and the most serene of his odes. And of course, I enjoy Ode to a Nightingale and Grecian Urn because they have a different kind of energy. So, and I love the sonnets on first looking into Chapman's Homer, because it's an invitation to read that you cannot refuse. And when I have fears that I may cease to be, because it's a fear that we all share, perhaps not with the same intensity as Keats, but I think today many of us may share it a little more intensely than we would normally. Okay, so I do have many favorites, but these are my top favorites.
So maybe we'll ask you one last question, Professor Rowe, and then you can...
I'll give you my favorite poems first.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I agree.
Go ahead.
I agree very much with Professor Mathew with the Nightingale Ode, and on first looking into Chapman's Homer, a poem that always shows something new every time one rereads it. It's quite extraordinary how that poem is endlessly exciting and rewarding to read and to reread. All of the odes, obviously, but particularly that odd one, the Ode on Indolence. That very enigmatic and strange poem that some people say is not in the order that the verses are not in the order that Keats intended, and they should be in a different order, has been one of the debates that has grown up around Ode on Indolence. Well, whether it is, as it were, a postscript to the other so-called greater odes of spring 1819, or whether, as I think it may be, as it were, a preface, a poem preceding Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode to a Nightingale and Ode on Melancholy, and so on. Keats, as it were, feeling his way into this new way of writing that he was discovering early in 1819. It's a very enigmatic, slightly ghostly poem. And for that reason, I find it particularly appealing. And I do hope you'll all go and read it and see what you think of it. It's a very strange poem, very puzzling. But as I say, by virtue of that, extremely intriguing and rewarding to read.
Well, thank you so much. I think we should probably let you go.
Okay.
And thank you immensely for joining us.
It's not that I want to go, it's just I can't see very much because one of
Thank
my
you,
eyes
Professor.
has been up in the last week.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's been terrific, and I look forward to the ensuing discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So Professor Matthews, there's so many former students who have appeared on the Q&A and on the YouTube channel, many fans, and they have various questions. So here are some of them. Do you agree with the view that Keats is one of the most sensuous of the Romantic poets, specifically with reference to his use of synesthesia in his imagery? Lakshmi Muthukumar.
Definitely, I would say he was a very sensuous poet, and perhaps we remember him best because of his images that bring all senses into play. And synesthesia is something that he employs very often, and perhaps in the odes it's particularly obvious. In the ode to the Nightingale, you will remember, of course, the beaker full of the warm south. Do you remember all the suggestions of warmth, of all the tactile sensations of coolness, of heat, of light, and of darkness? Well, he's doing it all the time. And if you look at autumn, the opening of autumn, the first stanza, it is amazing how you can literally feel the fruit ripening, the tactile sensation, how the fruits are growing in their fullness, their plumpness. You can almost smell the fruit and the bees, and the honey, you can hear the sounds. It's amazing the number of senses that come into play in that stanza, and to create, as it were, the plenitude of that season. And of course, then it moves on into the next stanza where you have the visual imagery sort of coming to the forefront there. Do you remember all the images of the reaper at work? And then you have the winnowing and the storing on of the corn, the person standing by the cider press. A lot of visual imagery there. The gleaner balancing his way across the brook, balancing and then the final stanza, which is one of my favorites. It's filled with chances to use your auditory imagination, because you have the music of autumn and approaching winter mingling with each other, as it were. The songs of spring, just a passing reference. We don't really hear the songs of spring, but we do hear the approaching sounds of winter, and of course the sound of the gnats, of the robin, of the swallows. And it's amazing how we have the suggestion of the day coming to an end. I mean, the poem is coming to a harmonious end, as it were. And then you have the day coming to an end. You can see it, you can hear it, and you have the year coming to an end. And in a sense, it was the end of his life also, his poetic life, because after that, he wrote almost nothing. So autumn is, in a sense, a requiem that he has written for himself. A very beautiful one. And it helps to illustrate also the point about the sensuousness, not quite in the sense of perhaps most people will take sensuousness, but in the sense that all our senses come into play, and they come into play together to create images that you will never forget.
Thank you.
I could go on about images.
One of your former students, Brinda Chari, she says that you were an inspiring
Wonderful
teacher.
student.
Indeed, your poetry classes changed my life. My question, what are the pleasures and challenges of teaching Keats to the young undergraduate student?
I would say the challenge is simply that we approach Keats very often thinking that he's just a poet of the senses, and we love the music of his verse, and we love the magic of the images, and so on. But then as we look at the poem, and as we study it, as you must have seen when we studied the Grecian Urn together, there's so much more. There are so many layers and of meaning. And there's the kind of tension that you don't expect in a poem just of sensation. So you don't expect that very tough thought content, the kind of questioning that you have in the poem. So that to bring that to the forefront and to make them realize there's so much more to this poet, that perhaps is a challenge. And but I think my students were pretty good at rising to the challenge. And I would say the pleasure, it was all pleasure, because whether it is studying the images and all the senses coming into play, or whether it is, sharing his life, no matter what it was, it immediately resonated in the lives of the students. The fact that he was so young, the fact that he had a tough life, the fact that he accepted responsibility and didn't shy away from it, the fact that he knew he was going to die, and yet he found the focus and he wrote so much and achieved so much. All of that was so inspiring. I think it was mostly pleasure teaching Keats, and to students like I had.
Deepshika Vihingia asks, do you feel that a sense of melancholia is a key aspect of romanticism?
Definitely. I think it is one of the characteristics of the romantics, that you have the sense of melancholia and you have the sense of sadness in almost, no matter whether it is even, of course in Keats, it's I think fairly obvious, but it is so in Shelley. It is, for example, Ode to the West Wind, though in a sense it speaks of revolutionary change, which is what the West Wind symbolizes, though it speaks of sweeping changes across the world. And though in a sense the symbol is so powerful and the music also so powerful, the fact is that underlying that is the consciousness of the thorns of life, Keats, falling upon the thorns of life, bleeding. But the sense of melancholy, I would say, is all pervasive in Keats, especially the odes. But one is happy to see that in autumn especially, as he moves towards the end of his poetic career, he seems to be coming to terms with himself. Yes, melancholy, the image of the melancholy poet, and all of them invariably referring to Chatterton, who died so young. Yes, melancholy, I would say, is definitely associated with almost all romantic poets. And even if it is a little song like The Solitary Reaper, I mean, it's almost like a painting, The Solitary Reaper, Wordsworth's poem. But still the numbers are plaintive, and still there is that sense of sadness and melancholy. And you will remember images like Ruth standing amidst the alien corn. Yes, there is melancholy, not just of the individual poet, but of all humanity.
This is MP again with a question on the letters. There's a lot of poetry in prose in Keats's letters. Which are your favorite bits? And I can say that I do remember Oh, for a Draught of Vintage, Cool from a Cellar a Mile Deep, or something like that.
You're talking about the letters now?
Yeah, the letters. Doesn't Keats write about the about wine? And I mean, it's
echoed in autumn. And he talks about having pepper so that you can sense the wine going down, eating a little. Yeah, he believed in maximizing the sensation, as it were. Yes, we do have all that. But I think my favorite letter is the one where he says, do you not see how necessary the world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? Because that then explains why he can come to terms and why he can celebrate, as it were, life which seems to be full of fever, fret, pain, sorrow. He's able to accept it because he realizes that all this is not in vain. All this is to school an intelligence and make it a soul. As he said in that same letter, he calls it calls this world of pain wail of soul making. And I think we love Keats for his soul, not just his words, the soul, the thoughts that he has to give you, the inspiration that he has to give you to cope with the fever and the fret of this life.
Amal Toms asks about the dismissal of Keats' poetry by Byron. Would you comment?
Well, I think Byron was dismissive of a lot of things. It was his nature and it was his character. And I think he consciously, liked to project that image also. I think he didn't appreciate Keats as much as, say, Shelley did. Shelley was the most generous of the romantic poets. Even Keats didn't quite approve of Shelley or his lifestyle. Though Shelley always extended a very generous invitation to Keats to come and stay with him in Italy and so on. The relationship between all these poets is quite interesting. But Byron, I think it's part of his posture. It's part of that Byronic image that he liked to build and that he liked to sell to the public. I mean, he sold it. He needed to sell it, I guess. And yeah, he was a little dismissive of Keats. But I think to just go by that satiric lines in Don Juan, where he says, it's strange that this fiery particle should be snuffed out by an article and so on. Because I think he came to appreciate Keats towards the end a little more than he did at the beginning. But both he and Shelley did imagine that Keats was a man who could be snuffed out, could be destroyed. Snuffed out is how Byron puts it, but not how Shelley puts it.
A couple more questions that we'll take. MP again asks, in the sonnet, Why Did I Laugh Tonight? Keats appears to decide on the art versus life question by proposing another candidate as the winner. Verse, fame, and beauty are intense indeed, but death intenser. Death is life's high need. These are bittersweet words in this time. What are your thoughts on Keats's resolution of this debate in this manner?
Keats was always, as he says, half in love with easeful death. And who would, I'm quoting from the Nightingale, of course, there, where he says he's half in love with easeful death. And I think for someone who has watched, I'm relating it to his life as well, and the fact that he studied medicine so deeply, and to the fact that we are now dealing with the COVID-19, where being unable to breathe, seems to be a more terrible thing than actually dying. But to just fade away, to die easy, which is what he said at the end. I think I will die easy, he said. That is something that he must have desired, because it's very, it's frightening to think that you have to fight for your breath, that you will find it difficult to breathe, that you will choke on your own breath, the one thing that gives you life and the one thing that keeps you going. He doesn't, I don't think he tries to resolve it as such, but as in the Nightingale, the next image is of him becoming a sword to the song of the Nightingale. And that, in a sense, is a rejection of death, because he knows death, whether easy or difficult, is still death. And it means it's something so final. So constantly you have this flirting with the idea of death, especially easy death, and also a rejection and pushing away of the same that you have in many of his poems. And that is why, once again, autumn is so satisfying, because everything comes so easy and so naturally in that.
Since you are speaking about death, the ode on a Grecian urn, which you talked about today, the urn is not just a funerary urn that holds ashes, is it? I mean, urns or amphora were the styrofoam of the ancient world, really. They were used to transport wine and olives and oil. Of course, an elaborate one, such as the one Keats is describing, might have been a trophy or a prize of some sort. Could you tell us a bit more about the urn of Keats's imagination?
Well, when you consider an urn in ancient Greece, as you say, they were used as containers for so many things, sometimes for water, sometimes for wine, sometimes for cosmetics. Well, it was used for, as you said, for almost anything. But it was also used for the ashes of a person who has been cremated. And therefore, to many, the minute you say ode on a Grecian urn, it seems to emphasize, as it were, the subject of death. But, and coming to this particular urn that he's speaking about, well, everybody has tried to find the urn on which Keats has based his poem. It's like searching for the Holy Grail. You'll never find it. For the simple reason that he has always been fascinated by Greek art and Greek literature. And from his early days in Enfield, he has been looking at Greek art. He has been studying Greek art, Greek literature, and therefore, this particular urn very clearly is an urn of his imagination. And he draws details from across the years, what he has seen, what he has imagined. We do know that the Elgin marbles sparked up, as it were. It was the immediate reason, perhaps, for him writing Ode on a Grecian Urn. And while he must have seen many urns, there's no one urn that you can identify as being the urn that he's writing about. For the simple reason, as I said, it's a composite picture of many urns that he must have seen and he must have imagined. To quote his own lines, we say, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Now, the urn, an actual urn, no doubt, very often there were pictures painted, or there were things carved on it or engraved on it. There were different ways of portraying stories. Very often the urns did tell stories in Greece.
But I think people, isn't it? And of ordinary people, not of the nobility. Now that's the thing about urns.
Yes, they told stories about people and about life. So I think the advantage of having an imagined urn, like you say, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Now, an urn, a real urn would tell stories, but an imagined urn, would tell even more compelling stories, such as we have on the Grecian urn that we studied. We have there the ecstasy of creation or art, where you have the piper piping. You have the throes of passion, where you have the lovers. And then you have the compulsions of community, where you have the procession. And of course, he takes you even further and asks you to imagine what is not on the urn. So yeah, I would say he tells compelling stories, really because the urn is imagined and he can control every detail on the urn, from the trodden grass to the leaves above, and the procession, the individuals, the pairs, everything.
There have been a couple of biographical questions. One about, Keats had trouble attending school, didn't he? And another one, Keats was so generous, he wrote poems in praise of Byron, Chatterton, Burns, and J.H. Reynolds. That was MP again. About his growing up, he was more robust, really, than we think of him as this sort of dreamy, even the portrait that we have from 1819.
That is true. In fact, most people describe him as a robust boy, ever ready to play on the field and ever ready to pick a fight to support what he believed, to stand up for what he believed was right. So it was only later, that he turned into such a scholar and haunted the library. I think it was after his mother came back. Remember, his mother got married after her husband died, and then she was away for some time. And when she came back, she was a broken woman for many reasons, including, of course, tuberculosis or consumption. And I think it was then that he began to become so obsessed by books and the library. And yes, it is a fact that he was very generous and he recognized talent and he was quick to praise, and he has written so many poems in praise of books and other poets, his contemporary poets.
Professor Mathew, you know, there were so many students who have logged in, and you say that you would like to be remembered as a teacher of English literature, especially poetry, which keeps you grounded and gives you wings. Could you say a bit more about your relationship with the poetry of the Romantics? What is their appeal for you, and what is it that made you want to inspire all of us students to love them as well?
There are many things I could say about why I'm so in love with romantic poetry, but I would say that it began very early in my life, this love of romantic poetry. In the 4th standard, I still remember, it was Solitary Reaper, and behold her standing single in the field, yon solitary highland lass. I still remember the poem. And when I became enamored, as it were, of the plaintive numbers, it was the melancholy note, it was the music, it was the fact that it celebrated simple, ordinary people and not just, you know, well-known figures from politics, etc. All those things appealed to me right from childhood, though I could not have put it in words like that. But it appealed to me right from childhood. And I think I continued to grow in this love of romantic poetry because, as you know, we do study quite a bit of romantic poetry even in school. But when I joined college, I remember at that time it was fashionable to admire the music of the Romantics, the magic of the romantic poetry and so on. But nevertheless, to sort of run them down as being incapable of intellectual thought, okay? So it was always, you know, after all, they believed in sensations, not in thought. That was the attitude. But I could not quite accept that. And I think the more we studied of the Romantics and we began to study the preface to the lyrical ballads, Biographia Literaria, Shelley's Defense of Poetry, and above all, Keats's letters, those informal but incredible letters, very informal, written to his brothers and written to his friends, sometimes artists, sometimes just a friend, and so on. You will find that there are such gems. I mean, there's such a strong core of, you know, thought about what makes a poet and what makes poetry. It's about the art of poetry. It's about the art of being a poet. And so I think once I realized their commitment to the art of poetry and to being a poet and speaking about, as it were, the tribulations of life and the joys of life, I think I became completely hooked and I stayed hooked onto romantic poetry. And without boasting, of course, I'd like to say my highest marks were always in the romantic, the paper on the Romantics, where I think I set a record in the university.
Well, when I was preparing for this talk and looking at your CV, I have to say for all the students out there, first rank in BA, MA, MPhil, first rank, all through. So maybe one last question on the odes. What are the other odes that appeal to you? You've spoken about autumn, about Grecian Urn today, but what is it about the odes? You know, why did he pick the form?
The odes, as a student of literature, if you study the odes, especially the odes of 1819, and here I think I would concentrate, though Nicholas Rowe said that his favorite is Ode to Indolence. I think I'm not that fond of that poem. And it is a fact that Keats himself said that he enjoyed that sonnet, that ode the most, he says. He says it in one of his letters. he enjoyed. I think it was the process of writing it. But I think he himself was not quite satisfied with that ode, which is why it is enigmatic and a little difficult also. And it was published only in 1848, if I remember right, well after his death. Not published with the 1819 poems, though it must have been written around that time, okay? Though we only know the timing of Ode to a Nightingale, which Charles Browne describes as having been written in summer under that plum tree in the Hampstead House, okay, Wentworth Place. But so we know that was written in summer, and we know that in autumn, he wrote To Autumn. So those two odes we can place in time. The other odes to a nightingale, melancholy, and so on, we are not very sure of the time when he wrote it. Okay, and ode to Psyche. So I think among the immortal odes there, we would list ode to Psyche, okay, or ode to a nightingale, ode on a Grecian urn, ode to melancholy, and of course to autumn. So 5 of those odes, they come together and they have a kind of unity also, because first of all, he adapts a stanza which is taken from his study of both the Shakespearean sonnet as well as the Miltonic sonnet, because you have the quatrain, the first quatrain is almost invariably taken from the Shakespearean sonnet, and then you have the sestet, which is in a sense from the Miltonic, okay? And in ode on, To Autumn, he adds one more extra line. So it's not just 10 lines, but 11 lines to the stanza, because he wanted it to have a slower and a more serene kind of quality, and a more, and a kind of fullness, if you know what I mean. So for those reasons, you'll find, first of all, if you just study stanza and rhyme schemes in his odes, they are amazing, but I won't dwell on that because it's very difficult to follow. But if you look at the theme, for example, Ode to Psyche, he's dealing with the one goddess, okay? Psyche was a human being who was elevated to a goddess. And she was elevated because of her love and her willingness to suffer for the sake of her love. So you notice that this theme of suffering and suffering, elevation through suffering, begins right there in Ode to Psyche. After that, of course, you have the Ode to the Nightingale, where he concentrates on this world of sorrow, and therefore his desire to fade away into the world of the nightingale. I don't want to go into detail because we could be talking forever, but you have there his creation of the world of the nightingale. You remember already with his imagination transports him there, and he's there in the world of the nightingale. But even as we rejoice in the beauty and the eternal quality of the world of the nightingale, we begin to realize that we cannot stay in this world too long, that a human being must return to his own world. As I say, I always quote Wordsworth's lines about this is the very world, which is the world of all of us, where in the end we must find our happiness or not at all. The place where in the end we must find our happiness or not at all. So he has to return to the human world. So he returns. There is sadness in the return, even as the song of the nightingale fades. So the next ode, which is Ode to Melancholy, takes up this idea of the inextricable intertwining of joy and pain. The fact that you cannot separate those two threads, that they are a part of human life, and that one can only enjoy one if one experiences the other. There is no other way of enjoying it. And therefore he says, one feels melancholy not when one looks at skulls and crossbones and graves and so on, but when you look at the most beautiful things in life, because there he celebrates beauty, the beauty that must die. So that realization is there, that something is beautiful because it must die also. Not just that it must die, but because it must die. The very nature of transience becomes beautiful. And that is what we realize in Ode to a Night, in Ode on a Grecian Urn, because there he's balancing, as it were, the transience of life with the permanence of art, and finding that there is something to be said for both, and that art really cannot substitute for life. And therefore we accept life with all its joys and all its sorrows, and the fact that it is temporary. But nevertheless, it is out of this terrifying world that is so temporary and fades so fast. It is out of this that art is created. So the most beautiful things in life come out of the truth and the reality that we must die one day. So that is the Grecian Urn. I think I've spoken enough about autumn. You'll find that autumn, in a way, is a celebration of life and an acceptance of it, because it seems to come so gently at the end. As I say always, I remember the Dylan Thomas poem, where Dylan Thomas says, "Do not go gently into that dark night, but rage," he says. But Keats is just the opposite. He doesn't rage in autumn. He celebrates the fullness of life, and he accepts, as it were, the transition towards the, remember I told you the third stanza, you have literally, first stanza is morning, second stanza is afternoon, and the third stanza, it is evening, and the dark is approaching. The darkness is approaching. Just as you have, as it were, the end of summer in the first stanza, and the feeling the bees have that such warm days will never cease. But nevertheless, autumn comes, and then in the course of the second stanza, we have not just autumn, not just the beginning of autumn when harvesting is going on, but you have, as it were, after the reapers, you have the storing of the grain. Do you remember the scene where the winnowing is going on? And then you have the gleaners who come after that. Notice how the transition is there, movement of time, as it were. And at the end of it, the processing of the harvest. You have the oozings of the cider press. And so there we have the visual imagination, and you see all these pictures. And in the third stanza, you have the requiem or the music. And the music, if you notice now, is not the music of early autumn, but of late autumn and the approach of winter. And so in a sense, it's a fitting end to the poem, a fitting end to the day, a fitting end to the year, and a fitting end to the life of Keats.
Well, with that, thank you so much. This was such a treat. I think for many of us, it was reliving our undergraduate days and all the richness of the classes that we enjoyed so much. Thank you, Professor Chandy Mathew.
I wish you had told me all this when I was teaching. I might have been inspired to greater heights.
Thank you, thanks.
About about poetry giving us wings, the reason why I say that is because when we read a poem and study it, in a sense, we are measuring ourselves, or for a while at least, for a few minutes, for a while, we extend ourselves, we become one with the poet, we relive his intensity, the intensity with which he wrote the poem. And in a sense, therefore, we soar on eagle's wings, okay, into realms that we have never explored before. We never even knew existed. And that is why I love that poem on Chapman's Homer, because that is really about reading and the excitement of reading and of experiencing. And he compares it to travel, and what can be more exciting than actually traveling into new realms and discovering, as it were, a new comet or a new, I mean, just imagine the kind of excitement that he's talking about. So I would urge you all, A, to read that sonnet, and B, to read, simply read, something that most people seem to have forgotten today.
Thank you so much, thanks.